J7.
Hit. A hit. You have sunk my battleship.
Excellent! Yeah!
Hello, listeners. It's Chris Bagg, and this is Upper Middlebrow. Usually, it's a podcast in which me and my friend Jesse Dukes talk about a book or film or some other element of pop culture we feel has both high craft and popular appeal. And we sometimes do digression episodes in which we speak to a guest about something tangentially related to one of our episodes. This episode is one of those digressions in which Jesse interviews Beatrice Marovich, a theologian, about theology and fiction and personifications of death. Enjoy.
I am here today with Beatrice Marovich. Beatrice is the author of Sister Death, Political Theologies for Living and Dying. That is a book on Columbia University Press, published in 2023. She teaches in the Department of Theological Studies at Hanover College in southern Indiana in the Ohio Valley. Sister Death, the book, also features a series of original works by the artist Krista Dragomer, who I randomly met, completely unrelated to Beatrice, not very long ago. So, Beatrice, welcome to Upper Middlebrow.
Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. This is really, really fun. We should also just say, you and I met, oh my gosh.
Almost 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Probably 20 years ago?
19 years ago. It was 19 years ago this month at the SALT Institute for Documentary Studies, where we were both students, me studying radio, you studying writing, which, in my case, it launched me into my current career. You did some other launching in various ways since then. So it's really exciting to reconnect, and congratulations on the book. And we'll get to the book, but I believe you have some reactions to an Upper Middlebrow episode or episodes.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about your episodes on Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, which is a book that I probably found out originally through colleagues in theology. I think Monica Coleman, who's a womanist theologian, wrote about this book, and I read Monica Coleman's work in graduate school and just became curious about Octavia Butler. So it was, I've had lots of conversations with her, people in sort of my academic world about this book. And so it was fun to listen to your episodes about it and hear what y'all had to say.
And we did not know, I don't think either of us knew going in that people might think of it as a work of theology or having a relation. I thought of it as, this is a famous Black African-American sci-fi writer, somebody who wasn't necessarily recognized for her talent in her time, although she was published and had book deals and things like that, but is increasingly celebrated and recognized, even though she's no longer with us.
Yeah, it is. As I think that your discussion made clear, it's deeply preoccupied with theology. Religion's kind of at the heart of it, although it's also, I think, a very skeptical book. Mm-hmm. She was a very skeptical person when it came to religion and had some, issues and qualms with religion and sort of the social and political power of it. And so I think it's a really interesting book for that reason. It's just a very theologically creative and extremely speculative text, which I think is one of the things that makes it cool, for me.
I think both Chris and I concluded that we think that Earthseed is not just a creation that she attributes to the character. Her theology, Lauren Alamina, that Earthseed as a theology is resonant, relevant, maybe even represents the author's belief as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's hard to know always, right. But, I think that to some extent it feels that way for sure. And I think, part of it to me also, it seems it's really important to her that Earthseed has its very highly particular dimensions to it. And so at one point she's having a conversation with, one of the, who will, someone who will soon become a follower. And he kind of mentions some parallels to Buddhism. And, she's yeah. It's similar to all that stuff, but it's not the same. It is its own thing. And I think that's true, but I also definitely think, she's pulling in a lot from her own background. And I think that like, there's a lot like that does seem related to Christianity as she probably encountered it in her Black Baptist tradition growing up.
Right.
And, given the fact that she does have skepticism, I mean, she had, she expressed in interviews having skepticism about, the influence that religion has on the world and how it has, often a quite negative influence, even though it seems to be set up to do something very different. And so, she wanted to think about how it could potentially have a positive influence. But I think she also was just extremely attuned to the various ways that it could do social violence to the world and can really actually divide people with.
Is Earthseed among like theologians, your academic colleagues, is Earthseed influential?
Well, I mean, I definitely think that, so Monica Coleman is a womanist theologian, and I definitely know other people who do Black feminist thought and Black feminist theology and Black theology who have found a source of inspiration in Butler. And I think in the last decade or so, more and more people have started to pay attention to her as a kind of interesting figure who, challenges theological tradition in a lot of ways. But I'd say that's like a maybe slightly newer development. Like, I guess a decade isn't necessarily all that long of a time. Like in my mind, it's not like that long of a time. But
well, me neither. I mean, I'm not a theologian, but I would say if I have one academic discipline that I'm closest allied to, would be history. So a decade is nothing.
I mean, I was interested in the way that you and Chris were kind of talking about like categorizing this book, like, what genre is this? And in some ways, I think that it's kind of an uncategorizable book.
Yeah.
But I wanted to kind of weigh in on that conversation a little bit because I think that, as I was listening to your conversation about it, it was making me think about how I feel like in some ways this book is like, it's like almost sort of torn between genres in a way. Mm-hmm. And I think that this has something to do with, the possibility like that maybe this is part of, Butler's own sort of theological speculations. And so she's sort of couching them in a story about a character in a novel. But there's also this dimension of speculative theology that does seem to be meaningful to her for whatever reasons. And I think it's funny because I was thinking back to like a different epoch in my career where like I used to kind of refer to theology as speculative fiction. Which seemed like an apt sort of description
maybe
to me.
Maybe a little insulting to some people, but I think it's funny.
Right. Well, I actually was like, fiction is a great place to go to look for
truth,
theological ideas. Yeah, and for truth and meaning and purpose. But I think that I think a lot of people get offended by that use of the term fiction.
Yeah, I could see that.
When it comes to thinking about theology, and I totally get it. And I've like, reined that in. And I actually do agree because I think that like, in the end, I think that like theology is something that makes truth claims. And I think that's incredibly important. And that's part of the way that it functions. And so it uses like a philosophical language to make fundamental truth claims about the nature of reality. And, I think that like theology kind of gets, it's like these truth claims that get kind of thrown out into this communal pot and sort of tested to see if like the ideas stick or not. And people debate and discuss them and take them apart and reshape them. So I feel like, theology just as a genre in general is, it happens very much like in a philosophical register, which I think there are definitely aspects of the book that function that way.
Right.
But I think that, fiction is, I mean, especially like the modern novel is like a much more modern genre. And I think, especially in a novel, there's a form of storytelling that I think often tends to push back against the sort of authority of some of those truth claims. I mean, there's something about fiction that just wants to kind of open up a space for thinking and storytelling that's like kind of hostile to those kinds of.
Yeah. And in fact, like the writer's task is to create fictions that feel true. And the test of that, I think, among the, does it work for the reader, right? There's no resort to authority. The writer should not ever say to the reader, you should believe that this character would do this thing because I'm telling you it did, and because I'm part of a 3,000-year tradition that is telling you that it did. It has to work, and it has to work according to whatever the reader's senses are the rules of this world that the writer has created. And the truth claim that fiction is making only works if the reader buys that the story has something true to say about life. And it seems to me like theology argues from authority and asks for faith.
Yeah. And I think that, hagiography is a genre that's always worked really well with theology. And I think that that's almost what you'd kind of expect to see this particular theology get couched in is a sort of hagiography of a character. But I think that, Butler is carefully not doing a hagiography of Lauren. And I think, that becomes even clearer in Parable of the Talents, where I think Lauren's role is even more ambivalent, right? Like she has this daughter who gets abducted and, I think that that book becomes a kind of stage where you kind of see her split between her mothering and her community building. And, I think it's uncomfortable and honest, and it's not hagiography.
Yeah. I haven't read a lot of hagiographies. I've read probably some founding theological texts, but what I'm realizing is that you really get Lauren, I think, is a prophet. I would define her as a prophet in this telling, but you really see her theology and her personality and her character evolve. It seems to me that a lot of saints they might get hurt, but you don't see them evolving into the person that they are celebrated for being. They seem to, in those stories, appear, as this perfect or nearly perfect person close to the angels.
Right. And even the Gospels, there's a flatness to the, if you're looking at the Gospels as novels, right? Yeah. There's just there's a lack of character development.
Yeah. Jesus goes away for 30 years and he comes back and he's Jesus, Son of God, right. Rabbi.
And there's lots of great, books and movies about Jesus, but they're complicated and they're psychologically complicated. And there's a sense in which they can kind of just rely on what everybody already kind of knows about the story. But she's both trying to develop this theology and wants to kind of take a skeptical and humanizing look at the founder of this religion. And so I think that in some ways that attempt to kind of give the reader something that's genuinely powerful and uplifting, and then also to kind of critique and be skeptical about the person who is the vehicle and the message it's a creative challenge, I think, that I could only imagine must have been incredibly difficult.
It is. I think one of the things that Chris and I both note is that there's not a lot of really lyrical, poetic writing in the book. There are moments of it, but even the moments, it's kind of like Hemingway lyricism. It's stark. But I think the thing that she manages to do really well, I'm reading another hard sci-fi book right now by Larry Niven and Jerry Purnell called The Mote in God's Eye, which I just kind of picked up because I wanted something fun to read and in a sort of lull in upper middlebrow required reading. And it is fun. And at first I was kind of underwhelmed by it because the writing is also not very lyrical and it is very hard sci-fi. And it really is just about speculating, well, what would it be like if we had an instantaneous drive and we could go to this other solar system and there were aliens there where their various jobs were different subspecies? Let's do a thought experiment about that. And it's as I've gotten more and more into it, I'm actually enjoying it more and increasingly impressed by its coherence and how it's kind of holding together. But I think one of the things I really like about Parable of the Sower, I haven't read Parable of the Talents, is it works as a hard sci-fi speculative story. You could just imagine it as airing on AMC after The Walking Dead. It is that kind of story, just a kind of survival story of people in this kind of post-apocalyptic. And it also works, I think, theologically. I find the ideas of Earthseed to be coherent, interesting, inspiring, maybe more attractive than many theologies that I have encountered in my own life. And that's amazing. To weave those two things together, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you know that there's people who actually practice Earthseed?
No, but I'm not I'm not surprised. I mean, what do you know about them?
I mean, I found them on the internet.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like, if it's much more than just like a sort of internet phenomenon, but like there's a website that's like, I think it's like earthseed.org or something like that. I don't know if it's just that they've put together like the ideas from the two parable books, or if they've, added anything in there. Yeah. But there's like a section where they sort of get into like what they call the Book of the Living. And I think they have like a Facebook group.
Interesting.
But I think
I wonder what the practice of Earthseed is, because, in the book, the only real practice that you get is this kind of Socratic dialogue, but that's because the prophet of Earthseed is present and alive in the book, so the disciples can talk with Laura and Olamina like Jesus's disciples talking with Jesus and asking him whether they should pay taxes, or like, what about the people who, only now came to recognize God? Why should they be rewarded as much as the people who've been good, I guess in this case, Jews for a long time, and then you get the parable of the prodigal son. It's the parable of the prodigal son. Right. Well, I want to make sure we get to Sister Death. So.
Yeah, I wanted to say one other
Great.
reaction, which is that you mentioned something as an aside in your conversation with Chris, and I think it was just kind of a throwaway comment, but I was like, oh, I have to say something about this because I disagree. But you said at some point you were having, I think this was in the first episode, and you were sort of saying, look, I think that like actually, she's saying that like God is the world. And I was like, oh, no. Because I don't think that for Octavia, God is the world. And I think like Chris sort of like responded to you, and I wasn't sure if he was disagreeing, but he was like, yeah, well, God is change, and you were like, yeah. But anyway, so God is the world. And I was...
Chris is often very gentle in his disagreement, so you got to let me have it then. You have to be the corrective.
Well, I think that, I can understand where that idea would come from, because I think that for her, like the idea of God is not supernatural, right? So like, it's not that God is some kind of supernatural entity. It's just some perfectly like real dimension of the world, right? She talks about God as being changed. But I actually think that the fact that like, she talks about like, like heaven being out of the earth or off the earth. I mean, I think that's actually a super important part of the whole thing, because I think she's an Afrofuturist, or, an influenced by an influencer of Afrofuturism. And I think that like that whole sense of like, the world itself being part of the problem. I mean, and theologically speaking, like the world is different from the earth. Mm-hmm. So, the world is a kind of, it's a sort of a human, social, and political construct, and the earth itself is different. And, I think that like for Afrofuturists, I mean, the world itself is part of the problem. The world is fundamentally anti-Black. And so part of the vision for Afrofuturism is something out of this world. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like out, like off of the earth per se, but it is out of this world. And I think that like, the location in the heavens is part of, I think, her push to sort of keep trying to imagine a way of life beyond the world.
So, but it could be we remake this world so that it's not this earth and this social world. So, but it could also be we go someplace where the structures that have been set up in this world aren't present, and we build on fertile and unmarked ground a new world.
Right. And unlike the techno-capitalist vision of space like colonization, like Earthseed wants to seed like the best of the earth in another place, right? Outside of this world. And so it brings like the earthiness of Earth. I mean, that's kind of like, I think, part of the hope, right? Like the earthiness of Earth is something that can be brought outside of the world, possibly even to other planets. Like, it's like, I think that kind of dynamic vision is part of the hope. And it's like wanting to bring like our like kind of raw humanity, like the good and beautiful dimensions of it. And, all of the sort of dimensions of the natural world that have fed that kind of beauty and humanity, like wanting to find ways of bringing that outside of the world and to find an otherwise space where those things can kind of thrive and be realized.
All right. So note to Jesse, Beatrice says that God is not the world and earth seed. What you're saying though about, and that makes sense. It's heavily echoed in Neuromancer, which we read even more recently. I don't know if you've read that book, but there is this techno space capitalism that is the primary antagonist, and they have a orbital colony, and then near that colony is a kind of anarcho-Rastafarian colony of habitats and spaceships called Zion, and they refer to everything else that's happening in space as Babylon. And I feel like it's the same metaphoric as I understand Rastafarian religion, Zion and Babylon. And yeah, well, that's fascinating. I don't have anything else to say about that other than I'm just going to let it sink in. And maybe I'll go back and read the Earthseed writings to see where I got the idea that God was the world. I definitely had the idea that God is change, but we have the power to change the world, and that so that these concepts are sort of intermingling in interesting ways that they don't necessarily do in, say, Christian theology or other theologies.
And because God is change, God is present in the world. So I pulled just one little passage. She writes, God is change, seed to tree, tree to forest, rain to river, river to sea, grubs to bees, bees to swarm, from one many, from many one, forever uniting, growing, dissolving, forever changing. The universe is God's self-portrait. Mm-hmm. So there's like a dimension of kind of incarnation there, like God can become incarnate in the world to the extent that, because I think that God is not something so sort of solid for her as the world, or sort of, it's more of a process, or sort of, there's a fluidity or kind of unlocalizability to it.
But it is, seed is the dominant metaphor. It is the grain that contains the information that is manifest in the physical world.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I stand corrected. We've sort of backed into it. So will you just say who or what is Sister Death?
So Sister Death is a figure that I kind of poached from the work of St. Francis of Assisi. And he has this hymn that's been attributed to him. And in the hymn, he's sort of celebrating like what, people now like refer to as the sort of like ecological connections between all things. And he's talking about how, how everything has, sort of been connected in kinship, and all creation is connected. And so, he refers to brother sun and sister moon, and, sort of has these personifies dimensions of the natural world. And, among these personified dimensions of the world, he refers to death as Sister Death. And I liked that. I, at some point in graduate school, I was asked to write an article about it, and ended up thinking about it quite a bit. And I kind of kept coming back to that image. But one of the things I didn't really love about the way he's using it is that he's thinking about death as like our sister. And it was interesting to me because I was like, man, it's still kind of like a power move on behalf of life, right? Yeah. It's like his way of saying like, yeah, Sister Death, she's like a creature like us, and she's mortal too. And ultimately, like what's most real is just life, eternal life. And that's what we're going to have after death. So don't worry. And what I do in the book is I sort of pose the question like, well, what if we thought about death as like a sister to life instead?
And as I read it, then surface and curate many, many examples of writing or stories or cultural imagery or other things that somehow relate to the idea of sister death, even if it's not necessarily feminine in a particular case. Or, one of the questions, this is a big one, but it just has struck me as I was reading through it. Why do you think we personify death? It seems like so many human cultures and theologies and mythologies personify death.
And I think it's like related to why we personify many things, which is I think that it just helps us to like better understand them and to have a relationship with them. Because I think that, if we think of something as a completely abstract event that we can't possibly understand or comprehend, it's really hard to have a relationship to that thing. And it's hard to sort of figure out how to cope with the anxieties that thing causes when we think about it. So I do think that to some extent, personifying death is part of how we just struggle to conceptualize and make sense of it. Render something a little bit less abstract through a weird abstraction.
Makes total sense. It's and you write about, and you alluded to this earlier, this idea that I think is very prevalent in Christian theology of death as the enemy. You argue that this is a harmful idea, or can manifest as a harmful idea. Maybe it's not always a harmful idea, but that, as I understand it, sister death is an alternative theology that is not necessarily embracing death or loving death, but is acknowledging the fact of death as essential to life, as an aspect of life. And this is going to be a very long question. I apologize. But I was thinking about, I grew up in the South in a community that I now realize was rather religious, Christian, quite a few evangelicals. My parents were both raised Catholic and both left the Catholic Church. Not necessarily atheists. Maybe they still believe in God, but definitely done with organized religion, both of them, at least when I was little. And so I can remember going to funerals among my Christian friends, many of whom were evangelical or conservative Christian, probably not all. And I remember there was a kind of tremendous performed respect for the corpse in that I found a little bit off-putting, the velvet casket and the flowers everywhere. And if the casket was going to be lifted up, it was lifted with this kind of ceremony and dignity and these hushed voices, but then also a kind of unwillingness to talk about what actually happened to this person, oh, when the end was near, she passed away, or she's with God now. That basically saying the body stopped working and this person we love died was a really hard thing for people to say. And I remember noticing this as even maybe a 10 or 11-year-old kid. It felt sort of strange to me. And it feels like what I'm describing is an aspect of the theological idea that you are surfacing and critiquing a little bit. But I mean, would you agree with that? Do you think I'm noticing an aspect of that idea that you've identified?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it is interesting to think about too, just American burials are an interesting, they're kind of their own interesting thing. I mean, especially what's kind of considered now a traditional burial in the US is you embalm the corpse, which is a relatively new practice. And then you put it in this extremely expensive box with all of these really fancy trappings. Right. And this is not true for Jewish burials or, Muslim burials, but it is true by and large for a lot of what, Christians have come to kind of think of as a traditional burial. But yeah, that whole thing is it's a new practice that's really it's connected to extreme American, material wealth that allows us to basically put, tons and tons of resources under the ground and basically mummify bodies like their own little, pharaohs' tombs under the ground. Yeah. There is a beauty, I think, in that kind of really sort of performed respect for the body. But I think lots and lots of people have sort of struggled with why is it that it's kind of taboo to talk about death in America. And so, there's a pretty famous book that came out in the mid 20th century, Ernst Becker's Denial of Death. His thesis is sort of that a lot of this kind of relies on a sort of denial of the reality of death. And I think that is probably part of it. But I also think that part of what I'm concerned about is not just the denial of death, but this kind of fear that death can't really be spoken about because it would mean then admitting that it's real, and admitting that it's real would mean questioning how much influence it actually has over our lives. I was talking to someone who was telling me that when he grew up in an evangelical family, and his grandmother died, he was not allowed to cry. And he wasn't allowed to, in any way kind of openly or like emotionally perform grief because, you know, he was told by his parents that essentially this would be like denying that she had gone to heaven, the denying that she was still with us.
Which seems
in that
rooted
sense.
in fear to me. That the idea that maybe she didn't go to heaven and she's just gone and her consciousness is gone forever is so terrible and scary that we must not think of that.
Right. Yeah, that there's a lot of coatings put over like the words and a lot of sort of like fancy footwork to essentially avoid talking about the fact of death. The book has been like pretty influenced by this, you know, what it's called the death positive movement. It's part of this order of the good death. And I think that a lot of critique that this movement's gotten from people is like, oh, what are you saying? Like, I'm supposed to be positive about the fact that we're going to die, or like we're supposed to be happy that we're going to die. And I mean, I'm really totally uninterested in like accepting death or, you know, let alone being happy about it. And that's not at all what I think the death positive movement is about. But I think it is just about accepting that it is a fact, and that, you know, if we can't accept that it's a fact, that I think that there are dimensions of care work that we can't actually really do because we can't really actually admit to ourselves like what's going on.
That resonates for me. And maybe there are people who find that sort of what I'm calling performed respect of the dead body to be beautiful and meaningful, and maybe that helps them mourn. And if it does, great. One thing I'm curious about is, could you just share some of your favorite manifestations of sister death? Maybe favorite is the wrong word because we're talking about death here, but notable, resonant, ones that stick with you?
Let me think about that for a minute.
And maybe not necessarily sister death, maybe just death personified more broadly.
You know, there's like a silly thing just sort of came to mind, but there's a little video that I used to show my students, which is like this. It's this lovely little video that I found on YouTube, and it's like this cartoon of death personified, but as this kind of little like cute sort of like ghostly floating skeleton type thing, and like a deer. And like there's this moment of encounter like where the deer sees death and death sees the deer, and the deer is like, oh no, like you're gonna take me. And death kind of like reaches out and is like, no, not yet. Right. And sort of ends up just like hanging out with the deer and like following it around, and like they sort of like become like fellow travelers in a sense. And then there's like this ending scene where like at some point, the deer is sort of like, okay, you know, like looking old and weary, and like death kind of comes and sort of like embraces the deer, and the deer kind of relaxes into like this little figure of personified death. And like my students, my students will cry when they watch the cartoon, and I'll cry too, like almost every time I see it.
Yeah.
Because there's something about it that's so, I mean, on some level, it's like completely unimaginable, but it's just, to me, that is like a figuration of death that I think is like really very much a counterpoint to like most other like cultural images of death that I've been exposed to as like an American who's also sort of suckered on like, you know, European culture and history.
But I feel like I see that from, even sometimes the Grim Reaper, right, which is the classic Western tradition personified death. Even sometimes there's a sense of kind of I'm going to gently guide you to the next place. Like, you know, meet Joe Black kind of walking with Anthony Hopkins at the end of that movie and being like, it's going to be all right. Don't worry, you know. And also for many people, dying is very painful and uncomfortable. And it does seem like sometimes death is manifest and arrived and represented as a relieving force. You know, your suffering is over now, and it's scary because we don't know what happens next, and many of us suspect absolutely nothing. I definitely feel like that image of death is a little bit familiar to me, if it rings a bell.
Yeah I think that like Octavia Butler kind of, because Lauren Olamina is like has this hyper empathy, you know, she like kind of almost has to like acknowledge that there are sometimes just things that are worse than death, and that there are like forms of suffering, extreme forms of suffering that are worse than death, and that there is, you know, that there is in some senses like a certain kind of peace in death. And it's like, I don't think she likes that. I don't think she likes to think about that. And it's not in a particularly like happy or hopeful message within the book itself. But I do think that is kind of just part of her general awareness of things.
Do you think, apart from Earthseed, we talked about Lauren Olamina, in your book, in your research, have you seen theologies of death that you find more attractive? Or do you think there are people whose theology of death is healthier than this sort of Christian theology idea of death as the enemy that you talk about in the book?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things that I think is kind of like a figure who I think is like curious and interesting is like the Hindu goddess Kali. So she's a goddess of death and destruction, but also creation. And I think like I've always been kind of like, just interested and compelled by that kind of that just sort of sees, birth and death and creation and destruction in a sort of tight and like integral relationship, so that there's not necessarily one without the other, because I think that is true and important. I mean, I think one of the reasons why we're able to have novelty and growth is in part because of decay and death. And I don't mean that as like a callous sort of like, well, that's just the way things work. And like, you got to make your peace with the fact that, bad things happen so that more good things can happen. But I don't know. I mean, I think that...
we don't have to be okay with it, right? Like, we don't have to like it or not feel angry or scared.
But I think there's just, I think that just sort of like demonizing death or thinking of it as a figure of evil, or thinking of that kind of like relationship between creation and destruction as fundamentally like bad and evil and like against the will of God or the divine or whatever. I mean, I think that to me is part of what I just object to. But I also think that part of what I have an issue with, especially in the Christian tradition, with the way that, the followers of God become, friends of God, and so friends of life, is that it does create a kind of split between, the people who choose to follow God, the people who love the God of life, and then those other people who are enemies of God and love death. And so there is this kind of inbuilt sense of inevitability that like those who choose not to love the God of life then have essentially like rendered themselves more killable or more more exposed to death.
I mean, you think about the colonization of North America and South America, and there was this idea that a lot of ideas about indigenous people. And actually, I just watched Martin Scorsese's version of Killers of the Flower Moon recently, which I didn't think was amazing. I thought it was all right. But one idea that I think he actually captured really, really well is this idea that indigenous people were kind of destined for death in the face of essentially a superior people, white people, meaning the people who are thinking that. And it seems to me like part of what you're tapping into is that in not embracing God, if God offers eternal life, through Jesus, and you don't embrace that, then you must be closer to death, and therefore maybe you're more deserving of death. I mean, from my study of history, which is not as in-depth as some, I think that's a real calculus that is happening throughout our history and the history of white supremacy.
I mean, absolutely. It was it was a dehumanizing strategy. And so, I mean, part of what I like I'm talking about in the book is that I argue that like part of this focus on, the pure life of God is that it creates Jesus becomes in Christian theology, this like divine human, somebody who can be both fully human and fully divine. And other humans, obviously can't be Jesus, but like they can, through the Eucharist, like Eucharistic rituals and practices, can become closer to God, more like Jesus, can follow in Jesus' example, sort of ingest a bit of Jesus's literal body and blood, because it's not just metaphorical, it's transubstantiated. You're eating the body and the blood. So you're essentially ingesting part of this like body and blood of the divine human. And so in that ritual, you're sort of becoming more and more like this yourself, is kind of the idea. And so it creates this sense of like, literally, people are becoming more divine. They're becoming more like God. And then there's those other people who don't do this, who don't follow these rituals, who don't have these practices. And they are essentially a different form of human. They're a less divine form of human, a more creaturely, a more mortal form of human. And so in that sense, like their lives just literally don't count in the same way.
I wanted to share, well, we were texting. I think I just want to acknowledge that we were texting about different personifications of death. And one of my favorite that I have remembered since the 90s when I saw this movie in the theater is death in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, played by William Hadler, who puts on this Czech accent, and at one moment he says, "You have sunk my battleship," when Bill and Ted are playing Battleship with death as a kind of, that's a callback to Everyman, the play where Everyman plays cards with death. And I think in The Seventh Seal, does the knight play chess with death too? So these are very high-minded literary references happening in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. And I went back and watched that scene, and it is hilarious. But I actually remember I was young enough when I saw it the first time that depiction of death was actually really scary to me at first. And I was, young enough that I was like, oh no, Bill and Ted are in hell. And at one point they have a gym coach who's making them do infinity push-ups, and Ted says, dude, there's no way I can do infinity, and so it's funny, but I remember actually being scared for the guys. And then what happens in the film is they beat death at, I want to say Battleship, Twister, Clue. At one point he's like, Colonel Mustard did it in the library with the candlestick, and he's totally wrong. And finally they defeat him so roundly at all these children's games that he kind of becomes their servant and has to accompany them. And he transforms into this very lovable character who is probably the best character in the film. Like, he probably gets the most laughs. And at the end, he's part of their heavy metal band, and people adore him because he's death, and it's a heavy metal band, and he's having a lot of fun. And I don't know, it's really funny, it's silly, but I think as a kid, that journey of death from really scary, intimidating master of hell into this personified form who's vulnerable and funny was actually very relieving. I remember really liking it. And I think it's not just because it's funny and silly, it's also because there's some human impulse to want to neutralize the terror of death. And maybe personification does that to some degree.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's diffusing, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, there's a sense in which I think some people would be critical of this, right? And would say well, you can't inoculate ourselves against the terror of what's real. And maybe there's a sense in which, if we don't take it seriously enough, then, we're just making light of trauma and tragedy. And, I think those things are true and can be true, but I also think that comedy has a place. And I think that there are moments for laughter. And I think if we can't laugh at really anything that happens to us, including the fact that we die, and if we can't, be able to make jokes about our mortality, then I don't know. I think that seems like a kind of impoverished way of being. And
I think people, who are sentenced to death or are dying rely on humor to master the fear. I think that, that's well documented. And I actually kind of want to write a book about this, because I think laughter is the mastery of fear. I think that's the sound we make when we're no longer afraid, and we make ourselves laugh when we're afraid in order to excise the fear. When you're laughing, you feel better, even if you're terrified, and then you might go back to being terrified a second later, but you staved it off for a second. Have you seen The Right Stuff, the film? I think it was Philip Kaufman directed, based on the Tom Wolfe. So it was Tom Wolfe's nonfiction book about the space program, the American space program, so Mercury and then later the Apollo programs, and how that evolved out of test pilot culture from World War II. And so you've got all these macho test pilots in California, and they're all competing to be astronauts, but they're also taking a lot of risks, and sometimes they die because they're flying new airplanes and testing the capacity of those airplanes, and they're very competitive, and there's a lot of testosterone, and they all think they're better at it than they are. And there's this character who is just called the Minister, and he's played by Royal Dano is the name of the actor. I don't know if he's related to Paul Dano, same last name. He was a character actor, and he's tall, and he has this very booming voice, and he becomes death personified in the course of the film. The film's like 3 hours long, and the first time you see him, it's after one of these test pilots' plane crashes, and he shows up along with the officer at the doorstep of the widow, this brand new widow, and takes off his hat, and she starts crying as soon as she sees him because she knows what his appearance on her doorstep means. Later, we hear him singing at the funeral of this same pilot, and he's leading the funeral, and he's providing succor and comfort. And then later, still, you see him at the launch of the Mercury, rockets, John Glenn, Alan Shepard, as if to say, the specter of death is always looming over everything that's happening. This is a mood of celebration. And I just, as I was reading your book, I just kept thinking about how that character is both terrifying, but then is also there to provide a service, and then is also singing the hymn too, offering some comfort in that moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of, I think that part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to just to not create too sharp a division between our experiences of what causes fear and what gives us a sense of beauty. I think there is when I read deeply in theology, and one of the things that I think has been meaningful to me about just sort of digging into this weird treasure chest of terrible ideas and weird ideas and cool ideas. I think that the stuff that feels most resonant to me is the stuff that is both aware of kind of just the beauty and the horror that is our life on earth. And I think, there's the sort of line from wisdom texts that gets cited a lot, but I think some of the meaning gets sapped out of it. But it's this idea, right, that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, right? And I think that sense of fear is really deeply embedded within theology, and just that kind of recognition of just the general fearfulness and the scariness of it all, and the scary feeling of being here. But at the same time, that's not as separate from the feeling of just being overwhelmed by the beauty of it all. And I think sometimes those two things kind of work together. And I think when we take our fear completely off the table, and when we don't look at it or think about it or even just discuss it, then I don't necessarily think we can be as sort of sensitive to or attuned to the things that actually are meaningful and beautiful to us as well. Which is really hard. It's one of the hard parts about being alive. I'm trying to teach a 7-year-old how to navigate all this stuff, and it's not easy.
Yeah. Yeah, although I think you write this in your book too, that kids are naturally curious about death, instinctively curious about death too.
Yeah. She likes to have talks about this stuff, and so we've had lots of discussions about it. And
what better way to clarify your thinking than to have to explain it to a 7-year-old?
Absolutely.
She's awfully intellectually engaged in the world.
Yeah, she's a little bit of a philosopher, which I don't think is an accident per se.
Sounds like not. If somebody wanted to purchase a copy of Sister Death, what would your favorite way for them to do that be?
Yes, if you buy it, go to the Columbia University Press website and use the code CUP20, and you'll get 20% off the book.
Oh, cool. And if people want to read your other musings, you have a Substack. Can you remind me where you would find that?
Yeah, it's Galactic Underworlds is the name of my Substack. So it's and I have a website too, which links to the book and the Substack as well.
Are there other Beatrice Maroviches out there?
Not that I'm aware of. When you Google Beatrice Marovich, I'm pretty much the only one who pops up.
There's a Jesse Dukes who's a liberal evangelical youth pastor in Atlanta, and we're Facebook friends, and he lives in a very different world than I do, and we've just messaged each other once or twice, and every now and again he'll post something, and I'm like, that's really I like him based on his Facebook profile. I like him a lot, and he occupies a world that I am sometimes critical of, but he occupies it in a way that I really appreciate it. And I don't. Yeah. I wonder if there's some kind of nominative determinism going on, or if it's just luck.
I don't know. That's kind of beautiful. I've always kind of glad that nothing else really comes up when you Google my weird name. But that's a good case for like, finding your name doppelganger on the internet.
Yeah. There might be one in Latvia. I don't know if you've looked there too. Of course, basketball fans are very familiar with your last name.
Yeah, I use people, not so much anymore, but when I was a kid, people used to be like, "Oh, any relation to Pete?
Pistol Pete, your uncle?" Yeah.
Right, and I was always like, "What?"
Yeah. What are you talking about?
Who's Pete?
Yeah. Well, Beatrice Marovich, this was really, really fun. Thank you so much for showing up on Upper Middlebrow and talking about Sister Death.
Thanks for having me on. It was really fun to chat with you.
Upper Middlebrow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes are the pastors and the boatmen on the river Styx. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by me, Chris Bagg. Big thanks to Beatrice Marovich for joining us today. And as a reminder, Jesse and I are both writers and editors, and we can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbagg.com and jessedukes.com. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time.